Hello everyone. Can you hear me? Welcome everyone in this today's China Talk, Rulesbased Order, China and West. Good morning to those from the UK, and good afternoon those from China, and good evening those in Australia. I'm Rebecca, China Talk Coordinator at UC China Development Society. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owner of the land on which we live, meet, learn, and work. The Gadigal people of the Arrow Nation, it is upon their ancestral lands never said that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge, teaching, and research within this university, may we also pay respect to knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of the country. I'm very pleased here to briefly introduce my society and touch on a bit about today's topic. UCCDS is a non-for-profit society run by our students. As you can see on the slide, the 4 pillars activities of CDS are China cultural events, voluntary teaching program at domestic China, mentorship to support new students, and academia panel discussion, just like today's webinar. And today, we would like to discuss the controversial concept of the rule-based order, which has been a buzzword these days, either regarding the code, the AUKUS, the CPTPP, or either current headlines, the cost extension. We'll first have a general discussion about 45 minutes and followed by the equal time Q&A session. So here are some simple tips about the Q&A session. So basically, hands up when you have questions, and you will be picked up by our moderator in order. Either speaking out or typing should be all right, and hands down when you finish. We hope today's talk will give you some insight on either conceptual definition of this order or relatable international ongoing affairs. We are delighted to have diverse experts today. And now I would like to introduce our great participants. We honorably have Professor James Lawrenson as our event moderator. He is the director of the ACRE at UTS. Professor Kerry Brown, he's joining us from London. He was previous director of the China Study Center at UC and currently the director of Lao China Institute at KCL. Professor Dingding Chen joined us from Guangzhou, China. He is a founding director of Interlasia Institute, Haiguo Tuzhi. It is an independent think tank in China. And Professor Beth Gill, chair of Department of Security Study and Criminology at Macquarie Uni. Welcome back again to our China Talk after a few years. And the last but certainly not the least, Dr. Beck Strating, the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia from La Trobe University at Melbourne. Again, we greatly appreciate your attendance and the support for our event. Now, I would like to hand over to Professor James to officially start this conversation. Thanks, James.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. It's great personally for me to be with you tonight. I've long been a fan of the China Development Society. I love what you guys are doing at the University of Sydney, bringing mostly international students, but some local ones as well, providing forums for discussion and debate. And I'm sure tonight's going to be another quality event, particularly given the panelists that you have just introduced. And also, can I just say a particular thanks to Professor Chen Dingding from joining us from a long way away in Guangzhou, and to Kerry Brown from joining us from even further away in the UK. So thank you very much, folks. We do appreciate that for those of us. And Beck, you're in Melbourne, not so far away, but it's a bit one step away from Sydney as well. So welcome to you all. So tonight we are here to discuss this much talked about concept called the rules-based order. Sometimes it gets a liberal put before it, the liberal rules-based order. Now, this is a conception of international order that is based on a shared commitment by states to rules that govern or at least constrain their interactions. This conception of international order is obviously it's pretty appealing for a country like Australia. In a world where might is right, a country like Australia probably isn't going to do very well in that sort of world. So the idea that there might be agreed upon rules where all states, big and small, particularly the big ones, commit to behaving according to, that's one that Australia naturally is drawn towards. Now, to discuss this tonight, as Rebecca said, we've got a fantastic group of experts who know a lot more about this topic than me. It is true that each of these experts comes with their own background. So, for example, Bates, we might lean on you a bit tonight to get a Washington perspective. Now, to be very, very clear, Bates is joining us from Sydney, and it's certainly not a representative of the US government. Same with Chen Dingding joining us from China. I'll probably be leaning on you, Professor Chen, to get some insights into how these issues are being discussed, and perhaps in Beijing. But clearly, Chen Dingding is not a representative of the Chinese government. So I just wanted to make that point clear. But it is good that we have people, and from Kerry Brown as well, to offer a UK perspective. It's been quite fascinating for me in Australia just how much the UK has roared back into the national consciousness in Australia, particularly with the AUKUS announcement. Okay, so let's get into this. I thought I would make one quick observation before I hit up our panelists with question number one. And this observation comes from a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, who I have a lot of respect for and who wrote a fantastic article on the differences in the way China and Australia see the international order. Her name's Simone van Nieuwenhuizen, and she wrote this article for the Australian Journal of International Affairs back in 2019. Let me just quote her by way of introduction. In explaining why this is an important topic, she says, quote, "States' understandings of the international order inform their foreign policy decisions. Mutual awareness of similarities and differences, therefore, has the potential to enable policymakers to better predict their counterparts' actions." Right, so we're not here just to talk about semantics tonight. We're talking about a concept that has real-world policy implications, and the better we can all understand how different states conceive of the international order, and in particular this concept, the rules-based order, we're all going to be in a much better place. So good on the China Development Society for hosting this topic tonight on such a relevant issue. Okay, let me get into question number one. Folks, you are all fantastic experts. So rather than inviting you each to give a 10-minute monologue, I'm inclined to dive into question number one and ask each of you one by one for a crisp response. Obviously, we've only got an hour and a half tonight, first 45 minutes of panel discussion. So if you could keep your answers not excessively brief, but crisp, that would be appreciated. Okay, here's question number one. Ben Scott from the Lowy Institute. Here's someone else who looks at the rules-based order a lot. And he read an article recently where he makes what I thought was a pretty fascinating observation. The term rules-based order is a very new invention. Ben says this. He documents the rise of the term and how it started ticking upwards in the mid-2000s, but it didn't really take off until 2014. We're only talking 7 years ago. That was around the same time that awareness of China's island building in the South China Sea started to become more into the public discussion in places like Australia. It then appeared, Ben says, 56 times in Australia's 2016 Defence White Paper. So that's an extraordinary development, from virtually nothing to 56 times in a major Australian document. Ben warns, though, let me quote him, "The rules-based order rhetoric can be an obstacle for policy development and prioritisation. Defending a global rules-based order that may never have existed, at least not in the form that it is often claimed, is an overwhelming challenge. So let me start off with this obvious question. Does it even exist?
Plus, I believe it's a $270 repair cost.
I'm getting, is anyone else hearing that in there? I'm getting, so, okay, I think that's someone's muted themselves. Beck Stratting, I want to go to you first because I know you've written quite a lot on the rules-based order, particularly in the context of the South China Sea, but also in the context of Australia's relationship with East Timor. So what's your take on this? Does the rules-based order exist in a meaningful sense? Is it a worry? The term's a relatively recent one. And to what extent is the order that we see right now, frayed as it may be, a derivative of rules that govern states' interactions? So does it basically exist? Beck Stratting, what's your take?
That's a really interesting question, and thank you to the China Development Society for inviting me here today. I'm zooming in from Wurundjeri country, so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and any Indigenous participants who might be here today as well. And I have to say, you've put together a really excellent panel and event, and I'm really honoured to be a part of this with so many eminent Chinese or China scholars. I'm not keeping it crisp, James, so my response to your question is I agree with Ben Scott's analysis on this. The rules-based order is a relatively recent term, and in fact, Shirley Scott has written on this. She suggests that part of the reason why the rules-based order concept has emerged is because of the actions of the United States in 2003 and the invasion of Iraq in particular kind of displaced the ideology of international law. And so instead of talking about a law-based order, we have politicians and policymakers now talking about a rules-based order, which is a lot looser. And, you know, I think that's possibly why they like it so much, because it's hard to pin down exactly what rules we're talking about. You know, the introduction pointed to laws, international laws, rules, norms, institutions, agreements. All of these can be kind of covered in this concept of the rules-based order. And I would say that on the one hand, it's kind of obvious that that some rules do exist. Sovereignty, you know, has been considered the basis of international society. So you could argue that a rules-based order exists through our regime of sovereignty. But what I'm more interested in my research is really how the rules-based order functions as a discourse, how it's used, what it tries to signal, and whether it has a role to play in constraining the behaviours of states or signalling to other states how you know a particular state views the international order, as you were talking about, James. And I think for Australia, it's really important that we note that the Defence White Paper started to use the rules-based order discourses quite a lot at the time where there was the arbitration tribunal ruling in the South China Sea, and Australia was actively calling for China to respect the rules-based order in the South China Sea, which brought it a bit of trouble in its own disputes in the Timor Sea, where critics were arguing that Australia wasn't necessarily abiding by the rules-based order itself. So I think that we should avoid taking the rules-based order on face value, because I think actually it's a lot more about power than it's about rules.
Right, thanks, Beck. Okay, that's a great observation to start with. So first one for everyone on this call, from Beck Stratting, don't take the rules-based order at face value, dig a little bit deeper. And I particularly noticed, Beck, as well, you talked about, from international law to norms, right? And they're all called rules. I mean, that's quite a spectrum of constraints. Suggest one is far more meant to be more constraining and prescriptive than the other. Okay, thanks, Beck. Okay, Professor Chen Dingding, I'd like to go to you next and basically just ask your quick initial take on the same question. Does the rules-based order exist? Particularly, what the discussion in China? What are people saying?
Thank you, James. I think in a very general sense, I think the term can hold, because without a basic, level of international order, we will not be able to enjoy, peace and prosperity particularly after World War II, right? So more than 70 years, we have enjoyed, largely speaking, global peace, even despite the Cold War and all that, and other conflicts in other regions and the countries. But overall, the whole world has enjoyed largely peace and prosperity. So I think international order has played a very important role in creating this and maintaining all of this. So I think everybody, if you ask, we all have the rough sense of, yes, we have had order, otherwise we'll be, World War III, whatever. So, but the key problem is, exactly what definition means, right? So if you mean by international order, then, whether it's international enough or whether it's, a concept like you just mentioned that only emerged in the last 7 or 8 years, obviously, that means, before that, obviously during the Cold War period, people had very different opinions about what kind of order there was, or was there even a global order? Maybe there was like a regional order within the Soviet bloc or within the Western sort of alliances system. So nowadays we are facing more or less the same problem. If you ask Japan, they would have their own definition of international order. If you ask India and ask China, I think it would be a little bit different from other countries think. I think in the Chinese case, my belief is that the Chinese government believes there is an international order. Nonetheless, that order is centered around the UN and the UN affiliated institutions. Because arguably right now, if you ask, who would represent the world as a whole, right? There's no world global governance, of course, but UN come closest to the global institution that we can envision. So the UN-centered system and the institutions, the UN Security Council, World Bank, and IMF, and etc. I think they together represent the international order because they are, after all, acknowledged and recognized by 190 countries altogether, right? No other institutions can have this widespread sort of legitimacy. So I think for China, that's the UN, centered system that would represent the international order.
Thanks, Professor Chen. That's exactly right. I mean, Simone made that point as well. For China, the rules that China is focused on are the rules that are, afforded by the UN, not any other group of countries, but that particular institution. Thank you for that. All right, let's go to London. Kerry Brown, good morning to you. A quick take from you, Kerry. Does the rules-based order even exist, or are we talking about something that's too fuzzy to be meaningful?
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for everyone to be here today. No, I mean, if there's an international order, I mean, certainly in the UK, there's nothing but disorder. So I don't think, I mean, I think we've become real masters of disorder. And I mean, I suppose the thing that I'm interested in is, well, what does order mean? Because that's the most important thing. I mean, you can have a rules-based system, but it can deliver very different things. And the key idea is what is order? I mean, I suppose the kind of problem is that you've got a situation now where there's such a significant new actor economically and in terms of geopolitics, China, that I think does have a very different view of what order is. If you look at language around order that's issued by Chinese politicians and has been issued by Chinese politicians, not just recently, but for a long time, it's a different kind of concept, really, and it's historically conditioned, and I mean, it's informed by all sorts of different kinds of maybe cultural frameworks that mean disorder is not illegitimate. I mean, it is an order, but it's certainly not something that the United States or Europe is comfortable with. And I mean, they have constructed, as a previous speaker said, a kind of system that preserves the thing called order till today, but I mean, it's clearly under tremendous strain. The only other thing I'll say is, I guess it's interesting to look at how kind of generic issues like climate change, for instance, that's very topical at the moment, should be topical, is kind of creating a new kind of almost bespoke order. The hope is, though I have to say, after recent news, that hope is getting weaker by the day that, you know, in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time, global leaders will try and do something significant about combating climate change and dealing with fossil fuels. You've probably seen the reports this morning of attempts to suppress by Australia, Japan, and others. I have to say, the governments of these countries.
Surely not, Kerry.
A report about, you know, fossil fuels, you know, not kind of reducing reliance on those. So I mean, I'm less optimistic than I was even a week ago. Even so, that is a new way of operating together. I mean, in climate change, you've got a kind of you know, sort of since, I guess, Copenhagen in 2009, then Paris in 2015, you've got a sort of international consultation process that's probably more extensive than the UN, an extraordinary kind of system. And maybe that's the future. You know, we'll have consensus over core issues, and we'll have a sense of what it means to combat those, even if in broader kind of governance areas, we don't have consensus and it's more scrappy. Thanks.
Thanks, Kerry. All right, back to Sydney. Bates, I'd like to bring you in here. Now, look, I don't want to pin you as the guy who's going to give us the Washington view tonight. That's not very fair. So you tell us whatever you'd like to tell us on whether the rules-based order exists. I must admit, I would be keen to hear your reflections on what Professor Chen said before. I mean, China's, you know, focus on order, and to the extent that there's rules around that order, is very UN focused. How's Washington seeing it, Bates? Bates, I think you're on mute still.
You'd think I would have learned this by now. Thanks very much, James, and thanks also to the organizers. It's really an honor and pleasure to be invited and to be on such a prestigious panel. Look, just quickly on the rules-based order, my short answer would be no, there is no single rules-based order. I think it's more useful to talk about it in plural. So there are certainly rules-based orders. I think we can point to lots of different regimes and ways in which states operate together, mostly cooperatively and under a certain set of rules. There are a lot of them, millions. So there are certainly lots of rules-based orders, and here I'm really stealing from the well-known China scholar Ian Johnston, who wrote a fantastic article called instead of rules-based world order, he titled his article "World of Orders," and his point being that yes, states do abide by rules, but it's just that they don't abide by all of them all of the time. Some sets of rules are better for some than others. And maybe that gets us a little bit to the question you raised there about the United States. I mean, clearly, when the rules-based order works for the United States, they're big proponents of it. And this gets back to Beck's point about, you know, it has, and this shouldn't surprise anyone. This has entirely to do with state power. And just, you asked me to respond to Professor Chen's remarks. I mean, I think even in the case of China, we know that even the UN world order is sometimes inconvenient for China, and it doesn't accept it. I mean, there's something called the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, under which a certain arbitral tribunal made a ruling a few years ago, which China's chosen to ignore entirely. So it's just not the case that big powers always follow any single set of rules. And that just gets right back to you, James. I'll close here. The rules-based order, if it does exist, where they do exist, is most advantageous and useful to weaker powers. But since we're talking about the United States and China tonight, mostly, I think it's obvious that there are rules-based orders, but big powers don't follow all of them all the time.
Thanks, Bates. And actually, that what you were just talking about then, the extent to which big powers do or don't follow rules, leads perfectly into my second question. And that is, you know, to what extent can we see China as a revisionist state that rejects the rules, or at the very least is seeking to shape new rules to rules that are more aligned with its interests? And I guess what does prompt me to ask this question is your point, Bates, that You know, you can certainly look at China and see examples when China hasn't followed the rules, and equally, you can certainly come up with a number of examples where the United States doesn't follow the rules. Now, that's not whataboutism, everyone. Let's be clear. That is comparative analysis, right? That's what good academics do. So look, could I get a really quick take from around the panel on the extent to which you think China is more revisionist with respect to the rules than other great powers? And the obvious one is the United States. Beck Stratting, what's your take?
Well, I'm going to agree with Bates on the issue of orders, because I look at maritime order and I don't think that China wants a whole-scale revision of international law of the sea, because in fact, as it grows as a naval power, principles such as freedom of navigation are likely to become more important to China, and that it has an approach to the South China Sea that it won't necessarily carry over into other maritime domains. So I would say that it is exceptionalist in its approach to the South China Sea and to, you know, things like the arbitral tribunal, rather than seeking to completely undermine a system in which China, a body of rules that China actually actively engaged in the negotiation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So in that example, I wouldn't say that it's revisionist. We need to remember that the United States remains outside of the UNCLOS regime. It hasn't ratified it. It's got its own form of maritime exceptionalism going on there, but that rather, like great powers do, they will try to elude the rules when it suits their interests.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because even when we're talking about the one body of rules, UNCLOS, as you said before, for China, again, just restating your words, you know, when it comes to the South China Sea, the way China, you know, aligns with those rules will be quite different to how it wishes to align with those rules in other parts of the world. And indeed, Beck, we've seen this, right? I mean, over time, we've seen more instances of Chinese naval vessels, for example, showing up in different parts of the world, taking advantage, and that's not a criticism at all, but, you know, taking advantage of the law of the sea to provide their own naval vessels with freedom of navigation. Okay, Chen Ding, can I go to you? What's your assessment of the extent to which, you know, is China basically on a par with the United States in terms of the extent to which it follows the rules, however those are characterized? Or do you think one is really doing a much better job than the other?
Thank you. I think I would sort of refer to what Professor Gill just mentioned, a great scholar, Ian Johnston's work. About 10 years ago, he actually wrote an excellent paper on I think China's compliance with international institutions and norms, right? Because they are, as you know, Professor Gill just mentioned, there are different orders, right? Different words of orders. So if you look at maybe 10 areas of international institutions orders in terms of trade investment, climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, and the maritime issues, so on and so forth. And his argument, his conclusion, of course, his conclusion is China for the last 40 or so years largely has been abiding all these international norms, institutions, maybe 80–90%, depending on how you make their interpretation. So, of course, I would also echo Professor Gill's earlier point that actually not just the greater powers, all countries, they would to varying degree, selectively apply international norms to their national interests. I think that's completely rational and it's normal, and it's in their interest to do so, because to do otherwise would be really irrational. So big powers or small powers, they all use international norms to defend their national interests. Actually, the international institution norms actually favor small states. Because if you think about it, without international norms, institutions, if we only talk about a brutal power, then we will be living in a much more chaotic global world. So the reason we are having sort of a peace and stability is because of the I think the power of international norms. Even though sometimes you see big powers maybe crossing the lines on the sort of here and there, but that's reality. That's the norm of international reality anyway. But in the case of China, I think if you talk about a particular case, I'll leave that aside because that would invite different interpretations. But I think overall, if you talk about China as sort of a compliance with international norms, I think at least in the last 40 years, China has done a pretty solid job in terms of compliance. The main reason I think is it's actually in China's national interest to do so, right? In terms of complying with international trade, investment. And if you look at historical cases, it's also the case that rising powers actually tend to comply with most of the existing international institutional norms. Well, in the process, they also try to adjust and adapt and modify the international norms and institutions. Again, that's a very normal process for any country. So I think it's not easy to answer the question, who is doing a better job in terms of compliance, whether it's US or China. I think you have to take into account a lot of factors, variables in the equation. But overall, I think it's based on the UN norms.
Thanks very much, Chen Dingding. Kerry, to you next. Professor Chen raises a good question, a good point when he says that, as states rise, it's often very much in their interest to follow the rules. Now, you would be aware then, better than anyone on this panel, that often narratives around China have, as in countries like Australia, have changed from 10 years ago. Now, and China is now being depicted as a state that that doesn't follow the rules nearly as often as it did, 10 years ago. I even think in my own narrow area of economics, 5 years ago, to be quite frank, China had a pretty exceptional record of following WTO rulings, for example. Now, of course, sitting in Australia over the last 18 months, my perception has changed somewhat. So, Kerry, what's your assessment on where China is headed with respect to, following these rules? Are we seeing China follow them less as its power grows, which may not be surprising, but still it would be an observation useful to pin down. What's your take, Kerry Brown?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sort of a conceptual problem that what China is, what it kind of has done. I mean, these are very sort of new and unusual, but basically the world's greatest sort of capitalist economy is going to be run by a communist country. I mean, this is kind of really a very kind of difficult sort of issue to get your head around, and I don't think anyone really succeeds particularly well. I mean, if you look at the rules-based system, let's sort of think of it as like a game of football, like everyone in the world can play football, there are rules, but people play it in a very different way and they don't break the rules. There's always complaints about how, the English team plays football in this way and European team play in that way, and the English team never do particularly well because the Europeans play it in a much more sort of, kind of daring and energetic way. The rules are the same, but the way that the game is played is completely different. Does that mean that, you break the sort of ethos of the game if you play it in a different way? I mean, that's the problem. The rules are not really contested. It's the way in which you play the game. But also, I think more importantly, it's the objectives that you're playing for. And there, I think things are very, very different. To look at football, if England were to win the World Cup, that would be a significantly different kind of meaning than for Brazil to win it, because Brazil seem to win it all the time and England only win it once a century. And so, the kind of emotions of what it means to engage in a rules-based sort of, practice, they can be very different and give the whole kind of practice itself a different kind of feeling and a different meaning. Rules do not generate meanings, they generate practices. But the meanings is where things get really, really complicated. China, broadly, as a player, has engaged with the practices of WTO, the practices of the multilateral system, one for self-interest, which is fine, but as it's become a bigger power, of course, that's become more of a problem because it's really winning in a lot of those kind of scenarios. When it joined WTO in 2001, its economy was a fifth the size that it is now. Its winning in WTO in 2001 is not the same as its winning in WTO today. And the second is that, of course, the bigger the player, by this sort of mysterious process, the more you can actually change, not the rules of the game particularly, but the whole kind of meaning and the ethos of the game. And so I think China probably, I'd conclude, is it's almost like an ontologically or unintentional revisionist. I don't think it's intending to change these things, but just because it's engaging with games with a different kind of the game of multilateralism, right? The game of the rules-based multilateralism. Because it's engaging in these with a different understanding of what they mean, it is changing them. And therefore it's changing how others engage with them too, because of an awareness of how this big and important new player is doing things with a different set of intentions. And that leads to a whole other kind of set of complexities about how we read those intentions. But the thing is that it is making a change. And I don't think that that can be really denied. And now I'll stop talking about football. I should call it soccer, and I should make clear that it's European or it's non-Aussie rules football. Okay.
Well, let me, on behalf of all the panel, wish England the best of luck at the next World Cup. Kerry, I'm sure next competition it's going to be your turn. But Bates, just a quick flick to you. We started off with you, but I would just like to follow up again. When I hear some folks, particularly based in Washington, talk about the future of Australia's region if China was the hegemon, they paint a dark future. They were like, you do not want to live in this region where China is the hegemon because the rules won't make any difference at all. But it's a quick comment. What's your assessment of the future that Australia is heading into with a more regionally dominant China?
Well, yeah, I can comment on that quick, but I want to just differ with my friend, colleague, Kerry for a moment, because I'm not sure all efforts to change the rules are necessarily unintentional or ontological, Kerry. I think what I was going to answer was the original question we had that I hadn't had a chance to really respond to, and that's who's the revisionist power here. What I think we're seeing is, yes, China is largely playing by the rules, if that's what we want to say. But what we're also seeing is increased efforts within the existing system to change some of the rules, or to loosen some of the rules, or to open up new rules that are more in China's interest to have as part of this new game that they're a bigger and bigger player in. And we can point to lots of examples, but having an even stronger sense of national sovereignty and inviolability of their borders. I think trying to soften the ground around the idea that it's okay to be an authoritarian one-party state. Soften the ground around the idea that what we do inside our borders is nobody else's business, period. All that sort of, those are some of the rules. Or for example, there was an interesting story a few weeks ago of, I think it was at the World Bank, where China apparently put a little bit of pressure on some of their publications in order for them to rise up in the ranks of business-friendly World Bank rankings of business-friendly locations. So this is using Kerry's very good example of a more powerful player figuring out ways within the system to try and bring about change. Is that revisionism? They're not doing it violently. They're not doing it in ways that are sort of against the rules. They're doing it within the system. So that's kind of interesting. The voices that you're hearing, I think they're loud in Washington. That's true. I don't personally agree with them all that much because I think it's very hard to. I don't know what exactly it is that they're thinking about unless they're talking about colonization or something on China's part of Australia, which I don't think is in any near or even longer term future. What do they mean?
Isn't it what they're referring to? I mean, they usually talk about it in the context of coercion. So if China's a regional hegemon, if you think the coercion China's directing at Australia now is something, wow, you wait and see what it's going to be like in 10 years. Well, now it might just be a good or two that's being disrupted. But what about supply lines, trade lines being shut off because China's turned the South China Sea into a Chinese lake?
Well, I mean, to the degree we already know the kind of economic levers which China can pull on Australia, we see them loud and clear. And who knows, they could become much more difficult, much more harsh. There's plenty of other levers that China can pull economically if they want to, and not just on Australia, but on others. So, whether that is the dark and dire future, I don't know. But I think maybe what we're talking about here is a capacity to exercise that type of coercion. Several examples of that type of coercion being used in this region and beyond. And I guess the real question is that truly the long-term intention? Is that truly the kind of regional order that China would like to see pursued? I doubt it, but I can understand where some people wonder whether it could be if we don't behave ourselves.
Okay, thanks, Bates. Okay, to our audience tonight, can I just send a reminder to you all to feel free to put questions into the chat box or raise your hand. I've got a couple other questions, but I'm quite happy to go to the audience soon. I'm not very good at doing two things at once. It's a horrible limitation of mine, so I'll do my best to switch between the chat box and recognize people putting up their hands, but just a reminder to you all that you're welcome to do so. Look, here's perhaps one last question from me before we go to the audience. How could we not talk about AUKUS tonight? Everyone's talking about AUKUS, certainly in Australia. Now, the Australian government has sold AUKUS, particularly, I think, push back against me, Beck, if I'm wrong here, but it seems the Australian government has sold it particularly strongly in Southeast Asia in terms of AUKUS bolstering the rules-based order in Australia's region. And it's used that sort of language to particularly soften any, or to make countries like Indonesia, for example, which has expressed some reservations, to make them feel better about it. This is not about overturning the order, it's about reinforcing the order. Now, I've got to say, I'm pretty skeptical of that line, but maybe that just reflects badly on me that I've become too old and skeptical these days. What's your take on this? Is AUKUS about bolstering, reinforcing the regional order based on rules, or is it really about backstratting the Australian government lining up with the United States to bolster the US power-led order in the region? I mean, to be frank, that's probably my take, but you feel absolutely free to disagree with me strongly.
Yeah, I think that you might be onto something there, James. I think Australia I'm playing around with this concept at the moment of it's a preservationist power. It is really seeking to uphold a US-led status quo that probably doesn't exist anymore. And so when it talks about the rules-based order, it's really a proxy for talking about a US-led order. And it's also a proxy for talking about China without always talking about China and the way that Australia perceives the challenges that a rising China might face, the challenges that a rising China might pose to Australia's security in the region. I think what AUKUS tells us about Australia and its outlook is that it sees itself as playing a bigger order shaping role in the region, and it wants to be by the side of the United States. It wants to anchor the US in the region. It wants to ensure that the US continues to stay a part of the Indo-Pacific, and it sees AUKUS, I think, as playing a role in that. Certainly the interesting part is the role of the UK, because the UK has been relatively recent adopting the Indo-Pacific concept. The French came on board with their Indo-Pacific concept before the UK did. But it seems like we're sort of going back to the future in some ways.
Get ready, Kerry Brown. We're coming to you next. Sorry, Beck, go on.
No. So I would say that this is not so much about the rules. Again, I think that this is definitely shaped by Australia's concerns, its strategic anxieties, and there's comfort in sort of relying on the great and powerful friends that are the United States and the UK. I don't necessarily think that's a great way of approaching the region. I think the diplomacy was really badly handled in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, but I don't think that that's what Australian policymakers or leaders were necessarily thinking about when they decided to announce AUKUS and surprise us all with the announcement.
Thanks, Meg. Actually, before I go to you, Kerry, I would like, we're lucky tonight to have Chen Dingding join us from China, because frankly, there are not enough voices from China in Australia's discussion. So we're really lucky to have you tonight, Professor Chen. So I would like to ask you for your perceptions of AUKUS. Do you see it as potentially contributing to a stable rules-based order, or do you see this more as a development in power terms?
Well, first of all, I think to be fair, Australia has, every right to choose its foreign policy based on its perceptions of its own national interests, right? So, every country does that. It's a fair game. So, whatever Australia chose to do, I mean, it's supposedly to, defend Australia's national interests, and whether that intended goal can be realized, of course, it's a different story. In this specific case of AUKUS, I think if the aim was to bolster regional order, international order, then perhaps one can ask the question, maybe has it consulted with other regional friends and partners, including Indonesia and far away, maybe France, and why the big surprise and all that? And the second of all, has it really decided to kind of, in terms of choosing sides, made a decision because in the outside world, there was this kind of impression. And I don't think Australia is actually choosing sides with the US. I mean, Australia, obviously, because of geopolitical, proximity with Asia Pacific and so on, it will be an Asia Pacific nation for a long time to come. So I think Australia would actually benefit a lot from working together with nations like Indonesia, Malaysia, and China, of course, vice versa. China needs Australia as well, particularly, as I mentioned earlier, as the winter comes, we need a lot of, Australian coal, and so on and so forth. So I think, depends on the next, decade or more so, the moves by all regional sides. It's only the beginning. I think Australia will, think, very deliberately and carefully with all regional actors. As long as, I think that the outcome will be okay. As long as Australia, did not decide to choose US on this regional security issue, because after all, US is far away, and then, consequences in the end will be on the shoulders of regional countries, including China.
Thank you for that. All right, Kerry Brown, what is going on with the UK? I mean, Beck raised this before. Should Australia be grateful because the UK is launching back into the region to bolster the rules-based order in our part of the world? Or is there something else going on here?
Well, I mean, like many, it's a strange coupling. I mean, for Australia and China, Australia and America to have an agreement like this, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And ANZUS which has been in existence since 1951, has been moribund really for a while. So, I think the security relationship with the United States is so significant that a measure like this, with nuclear submarines, which is of course a form of, like a kind of technology that China simply doesn't have and is not likely to have anytime soon. Yeah, I mean, this makes sense. What's the UK's role there? Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I can't enlighten you one bit. You know, we are trying to sort of promote in the UK this idea of global Britain. We have the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, I think sort of partially mobile, going through the region. It's just gone through the strait between Taiwan and the People's Republic. You know, but we don't have obviously any capacity to do anything massive in the region because we're not there. We're in Europe, right? And our principal partnerships are in Europe and with the United States. So I suppose to sort of demonstrate loyalty to America, that's important at the moment. We used to complain bitterly that we ran our foreign policy via Brussels, and now we've solved that by running it via Washington. So, I mean, there we kind of are aligned with the Australians too, who I believe do the same thing. Maybe it's done by the same desk in Washington. I don't know. I mean, I guess this is one reason why our enlightenment and great leadership in London have done this at the moment. I think the problem is with AUKUS, I mean, the region, well, there's no partnerships in the region. So you've got Australia, and as Ding Ding just said, you've got, the relationship with America. Well, that's fine. But in the region, there ain't no move to kind of, toughen up a security stance towards China. There's concern, there's ambiguity, there's worry. If you look at Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, all countries with long, complex, rich experience with dealing with China. You've got like the Quad, which involves obviously India and Japan and Australia and the United States. But at the moment, that seems to be just a talking shop. That's fine. And how do you deal with India on these issues? Well, that is a massive, complex issue. I don't think the Indo-Pacific is going to solve that because it's just kind of wishing up a region that doesn't really exist, like Narnia. So, I mean, unless we find the wardrobe to get through there, I don't think we're going to do that. So I, I'm really intrigued by, what this vastly important region is really going to do about China. What's their version of AUKUS going to be? ASEAN. I mean, are they going to kind of have a sort of common security vision towards China? This seems very unlikely when you've got partners like Cambodia sitting next to Singapore. So I think that's AUKUS does not solve that. It protects, I think, it gives some level of protection diplomatically and in security to Australia. It gives Britain some sense that we have a global prominence. That could be kind of questionable. And it certainly means America can promote a kind of containment strategy of some sort. But the regional sort of architecture, it doesn't touch that at all. It's almost built around that. And that's going to be the key area. These countries in the region, are going to be the ones that are going to come up with solutions. So how do you deal with your biggest security partnerships, not necessarily being your biggest economic ones? That's the fundamental problem of China that we're all wrestling with.
Thanks, Kerry. Look, great. We've got lots of questions coming in. I can see them here. Bates, just to go to you for a very quick comment. I mean, some people will say that AUKUS has some similarities with the Quad in the sense that it's a minilateral grouping that has real potential to bolster order in the region. Do you have a quick take on that?
I would say AUKUS has a great deal more potential than the Quad. The Quad doesn't envision anywhere near what AUKUS is envisioning. And I would even go so far as to say that even if not a single nuclear submarine ever sails for Australia, which, by the way, is a relatively high prospect, it's not a joke. I mean,
No, I know it's not a joke. That's actually why I'm laughing.
I mean, especially as an Australian taxpayer, this is no joke. Yeah. But more to the point, lost in all of the headlines about nuclear-propelled submarines, there's a lot more going on here. And I do believe the UK will be involved in it, but of course it'll be largely an Australia-US set of agreements that's going to mean larger presence of American forces in Australia, larger presence of American equipment and pre-positioned weaponry, a larger presence of American defense contractors working hand in glove with a growing Australian defense technology sector to develop and deploy and even build advanced weaponry here in Australia. So This is something very, very different than the Quad. We can argue whether it makes sense. Is it going to change the order? That's something else. But this is way beyond the Quad. Always will be. So I think that's something for us to think about. And I'll just throw one other thing in here. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the term of deterrence. And I think Australia, those who signed on to this, those who support AUKUS and understand it as a rules strengthening exercise, probably do so by making the argument that this bolsters deterrence in our region, in hopes that China will think twice before trying to use force to settle some of the differences it has with a lot of its neighbors, not least Taiwan. So I think that might be the sort of rules strengthening idea, if it really existed. I mean, this is a defense contractor's dream. That's pretty much what this is really about. But if we want to believe it has something to do with the rules-based order, maybe you could make that argument.
Thanks, Bates. Okay, let me now go to our audience questions. We've got a lot of them, which is great. So I might direct questions to particular audience members. Let me start with Sherry Simpson. To summarize this question, she asked to what extent Australia and medium-sized countries can rely on multilateral forums, and let me focus on one in particular that she talks about, CPTPP, to protect or further their national interests. Okay, so to what extent can Australia and other medium-sized countries rely on, say, the CPTPP to further their interests? Kerry, I might go to you here because I know that the UK is first cab off the rank when it comes to joining or wanting to join CPTPP. So what's your take on whether, how enthusiastic should Australia and the UK feel about institutions like that?
I think if there is going to be any, these sorts of more economic kind of forms of multilateralism, I think are the most benign. They're ones where you can experiment, and they're more meaningful. They're more and more meaningful because I think post-pandemic, we're going into an era where economic situation is more and more uncertain. And well, I mean, you hear politicians go on all the time everywhere about, how we're going to be tough on China or do this and do that. But I mean, I think the economics will determine the geopolitics. And I think, that kind of recognition means that to engage in inventive, innovative, different kinds of economic relationships, now that the sort of more global ones, like the World Trade Organization, are kind of less, wouldn't say they're less valid, certainly seem to have gone up a cul-de-sac. I mean, that seems to me very logical. And I think for the UK to sort of be involved in this makes sense. I mean, I think it's a way of working more deeply. It certainly makes more sense than sending aircraft carrier, let's put it that way. What's China's response? I don't know. I mean, it's going to probably use things like the Belt and Road to try and become a bit more of a kind of counter, weight. Chinese economic multilateralism is a work in progress, right? I mean, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and things like this, a lot of talk about them, and the BRI, I mean, an enormous amount of talk about it. But I mean, maybe this is something where we can kind of make China up its game to everyone's benefit, because it's been quite sloppy. And I suppose if you've got alternatives, there's many kind of attempts with the Indo-Pacific to make it a kind of economically an alternative to what China's doing with the BRI. I think that this makes sense. This is somewhere where we can kind of, kind of address our individual economic problems and not kind of have the nasty sort of political clashes that we seem to have elsewhere. Not that it won't involve politics, but not as sharply.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. Beck, I might go to you next. This question is from Nick, and he's looking for some analysis of why Australia chose to switch in the AUKUS arrangement towards the US and the UK, away from France. Why do you think Australia made that switch so boldly? Surely Australia would have known that it would obviously offend the French. And I know you follow the region closely as well, including the Pacific, where, surely any smart Australian diplomat might be thinking, some of these small neighbouring states might have some concerns as well. So what do you think is driving this switch?
Yeah, well, that is a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that I've got a perfect answer for it. I wish I kind of knew what was going on in the minds of leaders when they decided to announce AUKUS in the way that it did. I mean, in my view, I think that maybe a more appropriate way of doing it would have been to separate the French deal from AUKUS rather than bundling them together in the way that they did, having a bit of time between, doing the diplomacy around the French deal. There were issues with the agreement. Australia wasn't happy with the delays and the cost blowouts, and some of that may have been foreseeable back in 2014 when the Turnbull government, I think it was, signed on to the French contract. But there were some issues. Australia clearly knew about those issues. There were reviews that were being conducted about that, but that didn't necessarily need to be bundled in with the AUKUS deal in the way that it was and announced in the way that it was. And, part of the Indo-Pacific discourses in Australia, the conversation around this Indo-Pacific Narnia, if you like, I love that, Kerry, is this idea of middle power coalitions and minilateralism as opposed to multilateralism. But the thing is that Australia tends to like its minilateral arrangements such as AUKUS or the Quad as still involving the United States, which is a shame because it means that we're not really looking to other middle powers in the region. And France is an Indo-Pacific power. It has interests in the maritime area that align quite closely with Australia's in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Southern Ocean. France has, depending on how you calculate it, one of either the top or the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world. Australia has the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. They cooperate in maritime security quite closely in the Southern Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean. So to kind of disregard the French reaction in the way that Australia did, I find it quite concerning about our attitudes to non-great powers in the region. So I think that I think what Bates was saying about deterrence was probably a driving factor in why Australia has decided to go with nuclear-powered submarines. As I said before, it has a conception. It's moving away from seeing, I think Australia is moving away from seeing itself as a middle power in a global context to seeing itself as a regional power in a regional context. And that the nuclear powered submarines, stealth, endurance in particular, being able to conduct operations in waters that are not necessarily near Australia, but are further away in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. These are indications of the way that perhaps Australia's foreign and defence thinking is changing as a consequence of the broader changes to the distribution of power.
Thanks, Beck. Ding Ding and Bates, I would like to put a question to both of you. We might start with you, Ding Ding. This is from Thais, and it's a really good question. I want to get your take to see if there's going to be some contrast or if you both line up in a similar place. What Thais asks is, to what degree can we use or extrapolate analysis of Australia-China relations, contemporary Australia-China relations, to infer how China's relations with other middle powers are going to unfold, right? We all know the story in Australia, okay? We're in the deep freeze. There's 12 Australian export goods that have been disrupted from accessing the Chinese market. The governments are not speaking to each other. So, Ding Ding, What's your take on this? I mean, is Australia just very unfortunate and we're kind of a one-off? Or can we extrapolate something from Australia's experience to other middle powers? I mean, is this how China's going to relate to more countries of Australia's size in the future?
That's a very good question, but also very difficult to understand. As you know, we scholars of international relations or social sciences are usually very careful in terms of applying one case to other cases because it's dangerous. Each case is unique in its own way. So if you try to look for a general pattern by looking at a bunch of cases, there could be a risk or a mistake. Having said that, I think this in the case of China-Australia relations, I think it's very unique in the last 2 or 3 years, basically because of the larger background of U.S.-China kind of a geopolitical kind of a relationship going very, very badly. So I think that's the larger background. So Australia, for me, from a pure rational kind of a perspective, it makes a lot of sense for Australia to choose U.S. as a security partner because of history, because of cultural identity, because of even economic interests, and then many other factors, right? So it would be no surprising for me to understand that. But of course, whether that's a good strategy or not so good strategy remains to be seen. But I understand the logic behind that decision. So I don't think other middle power countries. By the way, I don't think we can. Again, use the term middle power to talk about Australia and even people use a small power to talk about Singapore. I think that's misleading because very simply speaking, if you look at CPTPP, right, the two largest economies in the world are not part of that. They all try to join the club. So the club was is initiated by middle powers, so to speak, and small powers. I don't think they're small in the middle in terms of impact and influence. So in this case, I think each country should be looked at individually in terms of their relationships with China and whether, for example, South Korea is an ally of the US in terms of security, but South Korea has so far, I believe, maintained a sort of a middle road between the two powers, and maybe there's some lesson to learn from South Korea. And if you think the middle powers, South Korea and Australia share some common features and common concerns.
Thanks, Ding Ding. Bates, what's your take on this? To what extent is Australia's experience instructive for other countries? Or also feel free to comment on, because often people like me, right, will say, well, hang on, it looks to me like Australia's a bit of an outlier here. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Singapore or Japan, they're not in the same doghouse. I mean, they've certainly got issues with China, don't get me wrong, but can they be instructive for us? So either side of that equation, I'd be very keen to hear your take.
I agree. I think I agree principally with Ding Ding on this. I mean, each case is somewhat different. Australia is a peculiar, has a peculiar set of geopolitical circumstances, which I think do differentiate it considerably from other middle powers, whatever that means, in the region, in relation to, especially its relation to the United States and how that in turn affects its relation with China. China's principal interest in Australia, besides what a wonderful provider it's been of the basic raw materials of economic growth for China, is its role as an ally of the United States. I wouldn't see any other reason why China would give a damn about what Australia does or says, other than those two things. And it appears, in many respects, China has even indicated that it doesn't care about the former, or it's going to try not to care about the former as much. And so I think it does make Australia a somewhat special case. Although, I would quibble on the South Korea case. I mean, maybe the real differentiating factor here is it will matter to China if you are a middle power who believes you can tell China what to do. It will matter to China if you're a middle power who takes steps which China interprets as directly contrary to its national interests, and it will treat you accordingly. In South Korea is a great case, and let's not forget about what happened when South Korea made an independent domestic foreign policy decision to deploy defenses against North Korean missiles. They got punished for that from China. So maybe that's really the sort of indicator of how we can tell how China will treat middle powers. It's whether those middle powers are too uppity, or whether those middle powers are both uppity and American allies. Well, then you're going to find yourself from time to time in some hot water.
Uppity, I like that. Australia's been quite uppity recently. Okay, let me now, let's bravely try someone raising their hand. Leon Yin, I can see your hand raised. Now, I'm not sure precisely how this works, but I assume I just invite you to speak. You'll unmute your microphone and then we'll all hear what you've got to say. Over to you, Leon.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I'm at Starbucks, so maybe a little bit loud. Thank you so much for this webinar. And my question is to what extent China, Chinese more and more aggressive and authoritarian unification progress, in terms of the ratification and the implementation of national security law in Hong Kong and the recent moves toward Taiwan, and how has that that authoritarian way of rule has imposed a disruption or rebellion to this toward this liberal rule-based order, and whether it's regionally or globally, and further how should we rationalize this justification of domestic affairs? It seems that for China, sovereignty has become a more and more frequently referred to justification for this international endeavor since sabotaging regional peace.
Thanks, Leon. So let me have a crack at trying to summarize this, and you tell me if I get this wrong, okay? But the question is, we've seen a lot of action from China in terms of the national security law in Hong Kong being more aggressive towards Taiwan, for example. And so your question is, to what extent are these actions really threatening the rules-based order? Is that right, Leon? Okay, great. All right. Well, look, I might go to you, Professor Chen, in Guangzhou first, and then maybe I might go to Kerry Brown of the UK to give us your perspective. Over to you, Professor Chen.
Yes, I think it depends on how people define that, right? So if you agree that it is indeed an internal affair, sort of an issue with regard to Hong Kong and in Taiwan, of course, it's now from the central government perspective, it's a province of China. So if you disagree with that, then the question stands. But if you agree with their position that it is indeed an internal affairs matter, then the answer would be very different, right? Because still, under the UN system, sovereignty is the most important international principle when dealing with other countries. That's still the case for the last 70 years. So I think here we have simply a issue of definition. Maybe reasonable people have different understanding of that issue. I think that's the starting point of this. But I don't think it's again sort of echoing the previous question. We can derive any sort of a conclusion from how the central government is dealing with Hong Kong and Taiwan. Try to apply that to interstate relations. That would be a big jump in terms of logic. So it might be more helpful, in terms of if you try to talk about Chinese aggression, so to speak, then by looking at maybe, economic coercion, the term again, it's debatable. China-Australia relations in the last year also, and try to apply that to, as Professor Gill just mentioned earlier, China-South Korea relations and other that. But then again, I think I would agree with Professor Gill. It's really largely a matter of national interest, right? So in all of these cases, my understanding is that China is, behaving from action-reaction kind of a perspective, right? There was, the South Korea decision to set up the subsystem, then, trigger the Chinese anger and the reaction, so to speak. And in the case of Australia, if I understand, of course, I know very little about this, maybe it's Australia's decision to, sort of call into China's practice in the public health area or other areas, or the recent AUKUS deal. I think that again triggered some reaction from the Chinese side, more or less. So I think when you talk about this kind of future implications, it's two things: whether it's a definitional issue or whether it's the kind of action reaction framework, or whether it's China's unilateral sort of coercion practices and the policies toward other small and middle powers. I think once we sort things through in this regard, we can have a better and clearer answer.
Thank you, Ding Ding. Kerry, earlier in the webinar, Beck mentioned this idea that China is displaying exceptionalism in the South China Sea, and I agree with Beck on that point. We often, as Leon asked, it's a good question. I mean, we're all, what's happening in Hong Kong and towards Taiwan is important for their own right. But I do want to ask you, how much can we draw from this for other countries? Because I mean, I've got to admit, I do have a bit of hesitation, because you hear this line, the way China treats Hong Kong or Taiwan, well, we're going to be next. Where I'm sort of thinking, well, gee, Hong Kong and Taiwan, from China's perspective, are pretty different cases. What's your assessment of that?
Yeah, James. I mean, as you know, I was based in Australia from 2012 to 2015, University of Sydney. And so I've sort of continued to observe the China discussion in Australia. And first of all, I wanted to express my deepest sympathy to you and your colleagues for the the sort of wounds that you bear sometimes, because it's about precisely this issue that even from the United Kingdom, you can feel the heat in Australia. I mean, it's like unbelievable. And I'm sort of, though I miss many things about being in Australia, I definitely don't miss this. The idea is that China's stance on Taiwan and Hong Kong is therefore profoundly indicative of, what it's going to be as a power to others. Well, I mean, I think there's big problems with that. I mean, we understand and know well the very specific meaning of Hong Kong as part of China's sovereign territory, and then Taiwan as part of what it claims is its sovereign territory. These are very specific cases, and they can't really be extrapolated from very easily. What China is looking for is alliances to support its position, and that's where things get tricky for countries, because anyone who does something that might seem to imply that they're supportive, for instance, of Taiwan having more international space, or even having much more ability to assert its de facto independence, then this immediately becomes the kind of getting close to the red line. What will be decisive is what might happen in Taiwan. Domestic politics there is going to be key. Under Tsai Ing-wen, I think it's pretty pragmatic and moderate. She's been very capable at dealing with the very, sort of big diplomatic issues of both China and of Trump. And then, obviously, the United States being much closer to this issue than ever before. As Australia probably knows, there's only one thing worse than being ignored by America, and that's being paid close attention by America. And you could say the same for, China. Maybe that's the definition of a great power. Kind of the definition of a great power is that them attending to you is far more problematic than them not attending to you. So, that kind of might be a definition. In the presidential election due in, I think, a couple of years in Taiwan, there's a possibility that there might be a candidate who would be a very strong supporter of overt declaration of independence. Now, I mean, that's very unlikely, but it's possible. It's not impossible. The problem with what is happening in Hong Kong and Taiwan is, while there are domestic reasons for the Chinese government doing this, right or wrong, and obviously my view would be these are not great things to do. Just make that absolutely clear. The way in which this is interpreted outside of this region, that's the kind of problem. You hear officials and diplomats all over the place say, the public language about China to China on these issues is not like the private language, which is more, you know, kind of collaborative and more even-tempered. You know, classically, when America met China at Anchorage in Alaska earlier this year, the public meetings were awful. The private meetings seemed, from reports, to be focused on specific issues and okay. But at what point, I'm just really puzzled, at what point does that sort of public, fractious, angry language, particularly recently from Australia towards China and from China towards Australia, I mean, that language diplomatically and publicly has a huge impact. And, you know, China has its wolf warriors, but Australia, of course, also has some vocal and extremely angry voices, including amongst politicians. I mean, at what point that language then becomes you know, that's the sort of tail wagging the dog. You know, we can kind of kid ourselves that continuing to use this very difficult language is just a public show, and it's what we have to do. But I think it does have an impact. And on the issue of Taiwan, I mean, the only thing I would say is that you don't muck around with it, except at your peril. I mean, it might not be that Beijing is doing, you know, kind of I don't know if there's a right or wrong, but, you know, you might profoundly disagree with what Beijing is doing. But you need to be aware that the people that bear the consequences of mucking around with this issue are the 23 million people of Taiwan who are on the front line. And I think a lot of their voices are much more measured and balanced. And you just have to be respectful of that. This is not an easy issue.
It was a stunning survey done by, many of you would be aware on this call, the Australia Institute did a while ago, where the perceptions of China invading Australia, I think it was similar to the perceptions in Taiwan of China invading Taiwan. I mean, it's unbelievably striking. Beck Strading, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I'm going to hand it back to Rebecca. Beck, I want you to wrap this up for us tonight by telling us, how optimistic are you in an age of great power competition, strategic competition, that this rules-based order is going to hold to a degree that has some meaning for Australia? Just a small one to end off on, Beck.
You know, I like rules, and it sounds like I'm down on the rules, but I actually, you know, I think that the legitimacy of rules, and I think I prefer the term law, international law, the legitimacy of law and norms is really important for smaller and middle-sized states, for non-great powers. And, you know, I look at the maritime stuff, and I think about how a country with 25 million people in a vast continent like Australia can defend such an extensive maritime zone that it has. And the answer is it relies on these laws and norms being legitimate. So I don't know whether I'm particularly optimistic about all of those sort of rules and norms staying in place. But I do think that it is, while I'm concerned about issues of compliance, and I'm concerned about issues of exceptionalism and hypocrisy and double standards, and the ways that our own exceptionalism can provoke states, can provoke them to accuse us of having those double standards and thereby undermining our credibility with our partners. While I'm concerned about that, I think that in some ways there's always going to be rules. I mean, there's always going to be some rules. It's just a matter of what those rules look like. I've got The Anarchical Society sitting here next to me, written by Hedley Bull many decades ago. And, you know, I think it just depends on what the rules we're talking about are. So not quite optimistic. I think there will be rules. It's just I'm not quite sure what they're going to look like in the future.
And at the very least, they're better than nothing. So Australia has got every reason to do whatever we can to bolster them. I think that's a nice way to finish the evening. Okay, Rebecca, I think I'm going to hand it back to you, or someone else from the China Development Society, to wrap things up for us tonight. Ian, sorry.
Yes, thank you, James. Right. Hey guys, I'm Yi Yang, the director of China Talk. And on behalf of China Development Society, I'd like to thank our moderator and the guest speakers' participation tonight, as well as your support towards our student-run society. We're greatly honored to have some of the most renowned figures in the field of international relations, Professor Kerry Brown, Professor Chen Dingding, Professor Bates Gill, Professor James Lawrenson, and Dr. Beck Strating. Thank you for your remarkable contribution to the topic of widely discussed rules-based order. You all have presented us an insightful as well as informative panel discussion, also very helpful for my essay. And I'd like to thank our audience today for joining us at this China Talk event. I hope you all enjoyed it. And now I'd like to kindly invite the audience to turn on your camera for a photo of today's event. All right, 3, 2, 1. Cheers, guys, for those who turned on your camera. Thank you very much. And Rebecca, would you mind sharing your screen for the PowerPoint? Right. And next, I would like to introduce some of the upcoming events from China Development Society. The China Development Forum is a prestigious annual symposium that aims to depict a unique portrait of contemporary China. Our next China Development Forum, titled Chinese Students in Australia, is scheduled for March next year, where the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor of University of Sydney will be joined by Chinese students, academics, higher education sector practitioners, and journalists to discuss various topics, including reasons for Chinese students to study in Australia, Chinese students' life on campus, their role in campus governance, and their prospects in China. And next is CDS Art Exhibition E, which combines Chinese and Western art and culture through many forms of artistic mediums. The exhibition that opens on 31st of October to 31st of December, and the event venue is located within the University of Sydney campus. More information can be found on our social media platforms. And lastly, CDS's yearly program of voluntary teaching, 野望支教, is a non-for-profit activity where we will be supporting Chinese schools in poor mountainous areas by providing education and teaching power. We also welcome any topic recommendations from anyone. You can reach us through social medias. And once again, thank you all for attending this event. Have a good night or good day, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
for having me.
Thank you, Big.
Nice to meet you, Ding Ding. Nice to see you, James.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. I'll see you later. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.